I hid because I thought that my Tourette's made me ugly.
God damn!
Sometimes the brightest smiles hide the deepest pain, and millions of fans were about to discover just how true that really was. They followed Baylen Dupree's journey on Baylen Out Loud, inspired by her courage and the way she faced life with Tourette's syndrome.
Okay, it's okay, it's okay. You're okay, she's going to get it.
But behind the laughter, the viral clips, and the moments that made everyone smile, a very different story was quietly unfolding. What started as an uplifting and inspiring journey slowly revealed something far more complex and far more serious. Baylen had been hiding a truth that would completely change how her audience saw her. Because the girl who made millions laugh was, in reality, fighting a battle that almost claimed her life. The girl nobody expected to go viral. Most children around the age of 6 are learning how to tie their shoelaces, memorize spellings, or argue their way out of finishing vegetables at dinner. For Baylen Dupree, that same age brought something far less ordinary. Her body began doing things she had not asked it to do. Small movements arrived without warning. Brief, involuntary sounds slipped out in moments where silence was expected. To a child who did not yet have the vocabulary for any of this, the experience must have felt both confusing and a little frightening, because there was no clear explanation for why her own nervous system seemed to be making decisions without her permission. What made the situation harder was that no one around her knew what to call it either. Tourette syndrome is a neurological disorder that often takes years to identify correctly, in part because its early signs can look like a dozen other things: a passing habit, a nervous twitch, a phase that children supposedly grow out of. Doctors sometimes wait to observe whether symptoms persist over time, because brief childhood tics can fade as quickly as they appear in a significant percentage of children. Families, unsure whether concern is warranted, often wait alongside them. The result is a long stretch of ambiguity where something is clearly happening, but nothing is clearly understood. Throughout her childhood and deep into her teenage years, Baylen moved through that ambiguity without a formal diagnosis. She attended school, built friendships, and tried to participate in the same routines as everyone else, all while managing physical responses that no classroom had prepared her to explain. Social situations became quietly complicated. Classrooms demanded a stillness that her body could not always deliver. Conversations required a steadiness that her voice sometimes disrupted on its own. Teachers may have misread her behavior. Other students may have whispered. For years, she adapted in silence, often without the support or understanding that a proper diagnosis might have brought. The nature of Tourette syndrome adds another layer to that silence. Tics fluctuate. They get better, then worse, then better again, influenced by stress, fatigue, excitement, illness, and factors that even researchers do not fully understand. A child can seem fine for weeks, then experience an intense resurgence that feels like a different person entirely. This variability can cause outsiders to question whether the symptoms are real, consistent, or simply exaggerated. It is one of the cruel peculiarities of the condition that its very unpredictability becomes a reason people doubt it. The diagnosis that finally gave her an answer and a new problem. The diagnosis arrived in 2020, just before she turned 18. By that stage, the signs had become too consistent and too clear to be dismissed as a phase or a habit. Clinicians could finally match what she was experiencing to the criteria that defined Tourette syndrome. And the label that had been missing for so many years was finally attached to her chart. On paper, this should have felt like a relief. After a decade of uncertainty, she now had a name for what her body had been doing since she was a child. But a diagnosis is not a solution. It is a door that opens into a different kind of room. Naming the condition did not change the condition. It did not reduce the frequency of her tics, soften their intensity, or give her control over the involuntary movements and sounds that continued to shape her days. What it did offer was clarity, which is valuable. But clarity is not the same as relief. In some ways, understanding what she was dealing with made the long road ahead come into sharper focus. Alongside the Tourette diagnosis came a second, often overlooked reality. She also had obsessive-compulsive disorder. OCD is not an unusual companion to Tourette syndrome. Research has consistently shown that the two conditions overlap in a meaningful percentage of cases, likely because they share certain underlying neurological patterns. For many people, having one increases the probability of encountering the other. When both conditions are active in a single person, they can amplify each other in ways that make daily life considerably more difficult to manage. Intrusive thoughts collide with physical tics. Rituals collide with unpredictability. The nervous system is asked to juggle two competing kinds of disruption at once. There was also a more specific and more misunderstood element to her experience. Baylen has spoken publicly about having coprolalia, the rare form of vocal tic that involves involuntarily saying inappropriate or socially unacceptable words. Coprolalia is the symptom that most people wrongly associate with Tourette syndrome, largely due to years of inaccurate portrayals in film and television. In reality, it affects only a small minority of individuals with the condition, which is estimated to be around 1 in 10. Her having coprolalia placed her into an even smaller and more publicly scrutinized subset of the Tourette community, a reality that would later shape how audiences responded to her online. When she dropped out of the classroom and picked up a camera instead. Like many young people who finish high school, Baylen had expectations for what came next. She enrolled at West Virginia University with the belief that college would bring independence, new friendships, and a chance to build the kind of adult life she had quietly imagined for years. For most students, the transition to university involves the usual adjustments: new roommates, new schedules, new academic pressure. For Baylen, it also involved a condition that did not cooperate with the structure of a traditional classroom. Lecture halls require stillness, attentiveness, and silence during certain stretches of time. Her tics did not care about any of that. They arrived when they arrived. They interrupted when they interrupted. The more pressure she placed on herself to stay controlled, the more her nervous system tended to respond in the opposite direction. Anxiety makes tics worse for most people with Tourette syndrome, which creates a punishing loop in any environment that expects composure. Traditional attendance quickly became unsustainable, and continuing to force herself into that setting would have come at a cost to both her education and her well-being. So she changed the shape of her education rather than abandoning it. She shifted into online classes, where she could manage her symptoms in a space that did not punish her for having them. This decision was not a retreat. It was an adaptation, and a practical one. It allowed her to keep moving forward academically, while removing the layer of stress that physical classroom attendance added on top of an already demanding condition. Around the same time, in 2020, she began doing something that would eventually rewrite the course of her life. She started posting videos on TikTok. The platform was exploding in that period, partly because the pandemic had pushed millions of people indoors and into longer hours of scrolling. Algorithms were rewarding personality, authenticity, and content that felt unvarnished in ways that polished television never quite achieved. Baylen's videos fit that moment perfectly, not because she planned them to, but because she was simply sharing her life as it actually was. Viewers watched her tics in real time. They saw the unpredictable nature of the condition, the ordinary moments between episodes, the humor she used to navigate difficult days, and the family environment that surrounded her. There was nothing curated about it, and that was precisely the point. Audiences had seen polished versions of disability before. They had not often seen something this honest. Within a short stretch of time, her following climbed into numbers that most creators spend years chasing without ever reaching. There was another factor worth noting. the pandemic itself appeared to worsen her symptoms. Research has documented that many individuals with Tourette syndrome experienced increased tic severity during this period, likely due to the combined pressure of isolation, disrupted routines, and sustained stress. Her tics were reportedly more intense during these years than they had been before, which means the content she shared was not a performance of a condition, but a real-time documentation of a body under strain. The millions of followers hiding a darker truth. Virality transforms a person whether they ask for it or not. As her following climbed into the millions, Baylen stopped being just a young woman with a condition and started becoming something closer to a public symbol. For many viewers, she was the first person with Tourette's syndrome they had ever truly seen. Not a fictionalized character, not a documentary subject filmed from a safe distance. A real person with a name, a family, a small-town background, and a camera she held herself. That visibility carried genuine value. Her videos began functioning as a kind of informal education, correcting misunderstandings that had circulated for decades. People learned that Tourette syndrome is not a behavioral issue or a matter of discipline. They learned that tics are neurological, involuntary, and often worsened by the very stress of trying to suppress them. They learned that coprolalia, while dramatic, is only one rare form of the condition. Her platform became a community for viewers who shared similar diagnoses and had spent their entire lives feeling unseen, as well as a learning space for those who simply wanted to understand. But popularity at that scale brings a different kind of weather. With millions watching, skepticism inevitably arrived. Comment sections were filled with people questioning whether her condition was real. Some suggested she was exaggerating. Others accused her of inventing the whole thing for attention. The irony was painful. The same variability that is medically characteristic of Tourette syndrome, the fluctuation between mild and severe days, became the exact feature that gave strangers permission to doubt her. If her tics looked quieter in one clip and louder in another, surely, they reasoned, something must be staged. This is the specific cruelty of online scrutiny. It demands consistency from conditions that are inherently inconsistent. It treats the absence of symptoms as evidence of dishonesty. It forces people already managing something difficult to also manage the judgment of strangers who know nothing about the neurology involved. Baylen's response to this wave of doubt was notable for what it refused to be. She did not become combative. She did not spiral into public arguments. She used the skepticism itself as a teaching opportunity, explaining on camera why tics vary, why symptoms can appear inconsistent, and why that variability is part of how the condition actually functions. It was a mature approach from someone still early in her 20s, and it allowed her platform to keep growing even as its complications multiplied. Behind the steady public tone, though, the cost of maintaining that tone was quietly rising. The first small cracks in what looked like an inspiring success story were already beginning to form. When TLC came calling. By late 2024, she was no longer someone traditional media could ignore. Television networks have always hunted for voices that already carry their own audiences, and Baylen had built one of the most distinctive young audiences on the platform. TLC, a network built on documentary-style programs about real people navigating real challenges, reached out with a project that would translate her digital presence into long-form television. Development began, and plans were set into motion for a series that would carry her name. Baylen Out Loud premiered on the 13th of January, 2025. It was structured as a docu-reality program, following her through the textures of her day-to-day life. Her family appeared frequently, not as background characters but as central participants, because their role in helping her manage her condition had always been inseparable from her story. Cameras captured mornings, appointments, meals, setbacks, ordinary afternoons, and the occasional severe tic episode that required patience and adjustment from everyone around her. The series also introduced viewers to Colin Dooley, her fiancé and a member of the United States Air Force. Their engagement had taken place in September 2024, which meant that a significant personal milestone was already built into the show's emotional architecture before the first episode even aired. Colin's presence added another layer to the narrative, offering a window into how a young relationship adapts around a neurological condition and around the practical realities of military life, including the geographic unpredictability that military careers often involve. Filming took place across two primary locations. The family home in West Virginia provided a grounded emotional center, the place where she had grown up and where her support system lived. Arlington, Virginia served as the second location, representing her growing attempt at independent living. The contrast between the two backdrops worked narratively, giving the show a natural sense of movement between comfort and challenge. Episodes also followed her to events like TICON, a gathering for members of the Tourette community, where she connected with others who shared similar diagnoses and placed her personal story inside a wider collective context. On the surface, everything looked like a young creator's dream coming true. A major network, a primetime slot, a devoted audience, family, fiancé, and a cause all woven into a single high-profile project, the kind of breakthrough that most people spend their entire lives hoping for. The impossible weight of being perfect for millions. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being watched. Most people experience it briefly and then return to the privacy of ordinary life. For Baylen, the watching did not stop. It followed her from morning to night, from social media to television, from strangers on the street to millions of viewers who felt entitled to know how she was doing at any given moment. The expectations were not always stated out loud, but they were always present. She was supposed to be educational without sounding preachy, positive without seeming fake, honest without letting her bad days bleed too far into her content. Worst of all, she was supposed to represent an entire community of people living with Tourette syndrome, a community she had never asked to speak for simply because she happened to have built the largest platform. Her family noticed what outsiders could not. They watched her push harder each week, smile through situations where genuine smiles no longer lived, and meet obligations she had quietly started to dread. At one point, she was attending therapy 4 days a week. That detail deserves a pause. 4 days a week is not routine maintenance, it is crisis-level care. The kind professionals recommend when someone is actively struggling, not simply coping. And during those same weeks, she kept filming, kept posting, kept performing steadiness for an audience who believed they were seeing the real version of her. The confession that eventually emerged landed with quiet devastation. She admitted that she had been embarrassed of who she was. This was the same young woman who had built her career teaching others to be proud of their differences. Privately, she had been doing the opposite of what she publicly preached. Her body absorbed all of it. Tourette syndrome reacts badly to sustained stress, and the stress she was carrying was the compounded kind. Her tics began intensifying beyond what she had experienced before. The platform she had built to raise awareness of her condition was now quietly making the condition worse. What the cameras never showed. Numbers can be a kind of confession when someone chooses the right ones. When Baylen eventually described her experience with the phrase that has stayed with her audience ever since, saying that what viewers saw amounted to roughly 30 seconds of 4 years of her life, she reframed everything the public thought they knew about her. The clips that had shocked them, the episodes that had gone viral, were not the worst of it. They were the lighter portions of a far harder reality. For anyone who had followed her from the early TikTok days through the launch of the show, that realization changed the texture of everything they had watched. The private years, the quiet hours inside her own home, had carried a weight she had never shared. It is one thing to know intellectually that social media shows edited lives. It is another to hear a young woman place an exact fraction on the gap. There was another loss taking place that most viewers did not fully understand until later. She had wanted college for reasons that had nothing to do with degrees. She had wanted a chance to walk across a campus without being recognized, to sit in a lecture hall as nothing more than another student, to build friendships with people who knew her as a person rather than a public figure. For someone whose identity had become tangled up in a condition and a camera lens, college represented a quiet possibility of becoming herself again. That possibility did not last. The co-occurring conditions that travel alongside Tourette syndrome for many people, including anxiety, depression, and OCD, began to overwhelm her in ways that made student life impossible. Attending classes became too much. Keeping up with assignments became too much. Social interaction became too much. Leaving school was not a small setback. It was the removal of the one environment she had imagined as her personal exit from fame. Every piece of her identity outside of the spotlight seemed to be narrowing, and the isolation that followed was a different kind of loneliness from anything she had felt before. Words that changed everything. Every crisis has a moment where the person living through it can no longer continue in the direction they have been going. For Baylen, that moment came in a conversation with her parents that was shorter than most small talk but carried more weight than any episode of her show. She told them simply that she had to go. 4 words. Not a speech, not an explanation. Just 4 words that a mother and father never want to hear because they understand instantly that something is broken. She later described that moment publicly at a panel event, where the room fell into the kind of silence that only honest conversations produce. She admitted she had not wanted to be alive. That sentence, said out loud by someone whose entire public identity had been built around inspiring other people, reframed her story from the outside in. The young woman who had made millions of strangers feel less alone had been drowning in a private darkness so deep that her own life had felt negotiable to her. Her parents did not pause. They did not weigh logistics or consider optics. They came and they got her. The simplicity of that response, stripped of any performance, is part of what made the story resonate later. A daughter in crisis, a family that moved immediately, no hesitation, and no camera in the room. Just the oldest kind of love, the kind that shows up without asking what it will cost. The ripple across her audience, when the full story eventually emerged, was quieter than expected. Fans did not flood the comments with dramatic reactions. They went backwards instead. They re-watched older videos with new eyes, looking for signs they felt they should have noticed. A certain pause, a certain look, a moment where her smile had not quite reached the edges of her eyes. Choosing to fight when recovery refuses to look like the movies. Recovery from a mental health crisis rarely resembles the version people imagine before they have lived through it. There is no single conversation, no sunrise moment, no triumphant speech that resolves everything. Baylen's return toward stability was slower, quieter, and far less visually dramatic than anything her show could have captured, which is part of why it worked. The decision to fight did not arrive as a grand resolve. It arrived as a series of small, difficult, unglamorous choices. Getting up when she did not want to, taking medication that made her feel unfamiliar to herself, sitting in therapy 4 times a week and speaking honestly about things that were not easy to name, stepping back from the platform that had shaped her identity, even though stepping back felt like losing something important. Each of these decisions cost her something in the short term. Together, they built the foundation of a life she could actually live inside. Her care team had to address a layer of difficulty that most young people in recovery do not face. She was managing a neurological condition, a mental health crisis, and the specific pressure of public figurehood all at once. Ordinary coping strategies had to be adapted for someone whose struggles were simultaneously private and publicly observed. Her family made decisions during this period that deserved their own recognition. They chose her health over the show, over the opportunities, over any external pressure that might have pushed them toward business as usual. There was no pretense that the platform mattered more than the person. The most important shift happened inside her relationship with herself. She began to understand slowly that it was allowed to not be okay, that asking for help was not a failure of the strength she had modeled for others, that her worth was not tied to her ability to inspire anyone. Alongside this came the practice of boundaries, something she had never been encouraged to consider. Some parts of her life could stay private. She did not owe the world every detail of herself. The quiet comeback and the new mission that found her. When Baylen Out Loud returned for its second season in October 2025, it did not feel like a relaunch. It felt like the continuation of someone who had been through something serious and had come back carrying different priorities than the ones she had first walked in with. The show was still grounded in real life, but the young woman living inside it was quieter, steadier, and more honest about what public life had actually cost her. Her move toward independence continued in Arlington, Virginia, where she worked on building a daily life with more autonomy than she had previously managed. The heightened drama of Season 1 had given way to something slower and more truthful: the reality of maintenance. It is a less glamorous subject than crisis, but often a more meaningful one, because it is the part of recovery that actually lasts. Her relationship with Colin Dooley carried a different weight now. He had seen her at her worst. He had stayed. That specific combination, being witnessed at the lowest point and not being abandoned, tends to reshape a relationship in permanent ways. The two of them continued navigating the logistics of his Air Force career alongside the real demands of her health, and their engagement remained one of the steadiest threads running through the larger story. Her tics notably began to improve. Treatment, stress management, and the simple act of stepping back from overwhelming pressure had a measurable effect on her nervous system. It was quiet evidence that the storm had not been permanent, and that her body had been responding all along to the conditions surrounding it. Her understanding of her own condition also matured. She began repeating a line often used within the Tourette community, pointing out that meeting one person with Tourette syndrome means exactly that: meeting one person. The line released her from the burden of representing everyone and gave her permission to have her own experience without treating it as a statement on behalf of others. Her advocacy continued, but the tone of it had clearly shifted. She spoke openly at a panel event about her darkest moments, and the audience responded not with applause, but with tears. Fans began sending her their own stories of depression and anxiety, opening conversations that had needed to happen for a long time. The platform that had once been powered by the pressure to be perfect was now powered by something simpler and far more durable: the fact that she had survived. And now, in May 2026, Season 3 of Baylen Out Loud is set to arrive, with the network teasing that Baylen and Colin are about to enter one of the biggest chapters of their lives. Whatever that chapter turns out to be, the young woman stepping into it is no longer the same person who first stood in front of those cameras. She is steadier, more grounded, and moving forward on her own terms. Don't miss the videos on screen now. They're just as interesting. Catch you in the next one.